500 years of Christianity, the evangelization and inculturation of Filipino Chinese, Chinese Filipino in the Philippines. History informs us that the gospel began to spread from Israel to Africa, to Europe and to the Americas in the West, and to Asia in the East. This happened because of the Spirit that came down on Pentecost, made the gospel possible to penetrate every culture. It was the power and work of the Spirit that made the message of the risen Christ proclaimed and understood in every language of the world. Both in the East and West, or the North and South, the gospel was preached and proclaimed by different groups of people. The same seed was sown by different sowers. It took root in different lands, but was reaped throughout the centuries by different generations. Looking at Asia, China is one of the vast lands that the gospel was able to penetrate. It was said in the book entitled A History of Christianity in Asia, Volume 1, by Samuel Hugh Moffett, that St. Thomas the Apostle left India and set sail into China on board of Chinese ships, and landed at a town named Cambel, which is unknown to us. The spread of Christianity first became a major historical event among the Chinese in the 7th century by the coming of the Nestorians led by Bishop Alopen. In spite of both religious resistance and toleration, persecutions were experienced along with the changes of emperors and state rulers. However, in the periods of religious tolerance, Christianity developed. In fact, the Edict of Religious Toleration in 638 allowed the first Christian church to be built in China at the capital Chang'an, and the establishment of the church was completed through the order of the emperor. When we hear about the first church being built in China, we speak of mission. Mission takes in different forms, and one of the specific paths it moves is through inculturation. John Paul II understands inculturation as the intimate transformation of authentic cultural values through their integration in Christianity and the insertion of Christianity in the various human cultures. But what does this definition mean? Two major movements are focused here. First, the gospel entering into a culture by mission, and second, culture responding to the advent of the gospel. Every missionary act is an act of inculturating because the agents of mission encounters cultures, integrates cultural values, and makes the people encounter Christ, who would in turn celebrate their faith, integrating their values into their daily Christian life. Thanks to Missio Agentes, that the gospel set foot in the various lands of peoples like China and the Philippines. The Chinese have a rich culture, and its cultural values also enrich other cultures. They have religious traditions and values which existed even before Christianity stepped into the mainland. These cultural values were brought by the pioneering Christian merchants and migrants to the Philippines. Before Christianity came to the islands, the Chinese already had come wave after wave and formed a cultural group with an identity of their own. They were Chinese, bringing with them their own way of life, that is, their cultural and spiritual values. We call these as the seeds of the word, or the Logos Spermaticus. Since they came wave after wave, they were known to be Sanglays, which is from the Chinese words Changlai, which means frequent coming. If mission is to be understood as inculturation, which is the meeting between the gospel and a particular culture, then the Filipino Chinese or Chinese Filipino is worth understanding because they are a people who encountered the gospel 500 years ago. A Filipino Chinese refers to the first and second generation Chinese who knows how to speak the Chinese language fluently and preserve his or her Chinese tradition in the family. A Chinese Filipino, however, is one who is integrated fully into the mainstream Filipino culture and may not be able to speak the language anymore. Yet, whether a Filipino Chinese or Chinese Filipino, both identities speak not only of historical missionary antecedents, prospects, and perspectives, but also new ways of understanding mission as inculturation. The three phases of inculturation. Revisiting the Filipino Chinese and Chinese Filipino culture will make us look into one of the fascinating missionary experiences in the Philippines. Missio Agentes continues to be a missionary priority in the three levels of encountering the Word. The seeds of faith that were planted among the Chinese in the Philippines during the Spanish colonial period continues to be the seeds of faith that the Filipino Chinese and Chinese Filipinos would sow in the world today. John Paul II said in his encyclical Redemptoris Missio, number 4, he said, "It is only in faith that the Church's mission can be understood, and only in faith that it finds its basis." The first phase, the gospel received through Missio Agentes. The first phase of inculturation illustrates the advent of Christianity among the Chinese when the word came to the shores of the Philippines through the missionaries. This missionary act is called Missio Agentes. As a seed, the gospel landed into a new people aside from the Filipinos. This first moment of inculturation was characterized by both acceptance and resistance. The first point, the new encounter. By reason and purpose, the Chinese came to the Philippines for trade and business enterprises. They did not expect that Christianity be preached to them. Manila was an attraction to them in terms of trade adventures. Manila served as an attraction to the traders who took the advantage of the opportunities that ushered the opening up of Manila's markets to the world economy. These Chinese came through junk ships, which were called sampans, most especially during the monsoon season, which is June and July. As Bishop Domingo de Salazar, the first bishop of Manila, began to preach the gospel to the Chinese in 1587, not all Chinese became Christians. Many resisted. One of the reasons for their resistance was their intention of coming to the Philippines. It was not for spiritual nor religious for what they came for, but purely economic intentions. Besides, they had their own spiritual life, which they have found redundant if they embrace Christianity. In fact, the increasing situations of abject poverty in China and the expansion of dynasties became central to their ventures overseas. Another reason for resistance was their religious practices at home. If Christianity was to be embraced, would it be of help to their trading and business undertaking? The Chinese who came to the Philippines practiced pragmatic religious pieties. Their popular religious practices are those that aid their safe journeys, their prosperities, and their safety at home. However, their popular piety became evident when Filipino historians discovered images of Guanyin, Matsu, and Guangdong. According to the book entitled Spain, China, and Japan in Manila, 1571 to 1644, by Birgit Werner, it recorded that economically speaking, however, conversion to Christianity was not a requirement for a fruitful life in Manila. The majority of migrants from China did not convert to Catholicism and kept their status as Sangles Infideles. The second point, impure motive. The beginning of the evangelization among the Chinese in the Philippines under Bishop Domingo de Salazar was also the initial step towards building of two groups of Chinese residents in Manila. Those Chinese who were not baptized were considered infidels, and they had to live outside the walled city of Manila, which is called extramuros, while those who received Christian education and were baptized were to live in intramuros and have access to the walled city. The intramuros was the walled city which was the seat of the Spanish government, and it was also to separate the Chinese Christians from those who were not. Likewise, the Parian became the center of trade for the Chinese. However, in the book of Werner, it was said that the Parian became the official silk market and theoretically the exclusive district for Chinese retail and artisan shops. For easier distinction, colonial authorities encouraged clear spatial boundaries between Christian and non-Christian Chinese. Binondo became the first quarter for Christian Chinese settlers. Baybay and Tondo hosted 2,000 Chinese in 1589. In 1594, the parish of St. Gabriel was founded for the Christian Chinese with Filipino wives and their children, Mestizo de Sangley, across the Pasig River. In order for many Chinese to have access to the quarters of Chinese Christians and continue to have trade, many have themselves baptized for practical reasons. If not, they have to be sent home to China and not be able to do trade in the Philippines. Third point, the advent of the apostolate. Those Chinese who accepted and were willing to receive the Christian faith were baptized and subsequently admitted into the mainstream of the society at the time. Baptism became the passport for some not to be deported, less payment of taxes, and not to be hindered in doing trade in the Philippines. In spite of this, there were Chinese who sincerely accepted the faith that began the gradual formation of the Chinese apostolate in the Philippines. Intermarriages were not only strictly forbidden, but it became accessible to them. Many Chinese became Christians and had begun to have families and became residents in the Philippines. Building communities, celebrating the sacraments, and being part of the local church are traces of the dynamic encounter between culture and the Christian faith. The second phase, the emergence of the Filipino Chinese apostolate. The emergence of a Filipino Chinese Christian community and apostolate in the 16th century were concrete signs of the integration between Chinese culture and the Christian faith. The Binondo Church, which was known to be Our Lady of the Holy Rosary, was founded by the Dominicans in 1596 to be the home of the Chinese converts. This parish was dedicated for the purpose of pastoral care among the Chinese. Besides, many religious congregations took care of the apostolate. In 1952, Pius XII acknowledged the growth of other parishes in the Philippines to take care of the Chinese. In his letter entitled Exsul Familia Nazaretana, he said, "And as the Holy See gradually gave its approval, numerous national parishes were established, especially in America. Very recently, to cite one example, parishes were set up by decree of the Consistorial Congregation for the Chinese living in the Philippine Islands." The first point, catechetical instruction. The use of the Chinese language for catechetical instruction demonstrates the integration of the Chinese culture with the Christian doctrine. To remain Chinese and become a Christian was not easy because the liturgy at that time had to be done what Rome prescribed. However, the method of catechesis was adapted to the Chinese culture. Werner remarked, "In 1597, both Binondo and Baybay had one church offering the Christian doctrine in Chinese. By Castilian friars, for instance, by Fray Juan de San Pedro Martir, vicar of the villages of San Gabriel and Tondo. There were few accounts on the exact number of Christian Chinese, according to the first baptism register of Santos Reyes, kept in the Dominican convent in Quezon City, Manila. 155 Chinese were baptized from 1618 to 1619, whereas Diego Aduarte spoke of a total of 4,752 until 1633. The Spaniards understood that the Parian of Tondo was home to Chinese Christians, whereas the Parians just outside Intramuros, Baybay and Binondo, were inhabited by non-Christian Chinese, or the Sangles Infideles. The Parian of Santa Cruz, for instance, remained under Jesuit supervision. The second point, syncretism. Religious syncretism was one of the immediate results that happened when the Chinese culture came about in contact with Christianity. The practice of subscribing to Chinese traditional religions while being a Christian was a phenomenon in various levels. For them, conversion to Christianity did not mean to abandon their previous religious practices. Besides, it was forbidden at the time to use other languages for prayers in the liturgy. Teresita Ang-si observed that the Filipino Chinese display and worship of Christian images and idols are commonly done side by side in Chinese temples, residences, and buildings. Likewise, Father Aristotle D. commented that in many Chinese homes, the veneration of images is varied and combined. An example to this is, he said, on the same altar is repeated in many home altars of ethnic Chinese people, where Guan Yin and the Virgin Mary often stand side by side. The third phase, becoming a community for missio agentes. The maturity of a relationship between the gospel and the local culture is manifested in the ability to share the Christian faith. To be an evangelizing community is the third moment of enculturation. The Filipino Chinese and Chinese Filipino communities that participate in the mission of the church is a community that is enculturated. Understanding enculturation as mission is highlighted by John Paul II when he said, "Through enculturation, the church for a part becomes a more intelligible sign of what she is and is more effective instrument of mission." Redemptoris Missio number 52. There are some signs of the third phase of enculturation among the Filipino Chinese apostolate. Maturity of the Christian faith in the Filipino Chinese culture and Chinese Filipino cultures is discernible when there is a contribution that is made to the universal church as well as to the Filipino Chinese society in general. 500 years of Christianity in the Philippines have borne fruit by making this fascinating apostolate an agency of mission gifted to give. It is noteworthy that a truly local church has to be rooted in its local cultures. As the Filipino Chinese and Chinese Filipino cultures are among the local cultures that exist in the Philippine society today, to appreciate them meant strengthening the local church in the Philippines. The Second Plenary Council of the Philippines saw this value when it says, "The progress made in evangelizing through the educational and pastoral work of the Filipino Chinese apostolate is a great encouragement. We need to intensify this, but we must look beyond our shores and take note of the missionary opportunities opened by the contacts that our Filipino Chinese brothers and sisters have with East Asian Chinese communities." PCP 2, number 109. A local church exists fully alive when it is in constant contact with its local cultures and become missionaries to other existing local cultures. John Paul II mentioned during his visit in the Philippines in 1981 and spoke to the Filipino Chinese and Chinese Filipino communities saying, "If you live inspired by the Christian faith and strengthened by the specifically moral traditions, you will, in a profound way, be truly Christian and truly Chinese and contribute to the richness of the whole church." The third phase of enculturation speaks of the contribution of the Filipino Chinese and Chinese Filipino communities to the local church in particular and to the universal church in general. We may mention 7 of these contributions or perspectives that indicate this phase of enculturation. First, a Filipino Chinese proto-martyr saint. One of the manifestations of a healthy relationship between the local culture and the Filipino Chinese and the Chinese faith is the canonization of the first Filipino saint, San Lorenzo Ruiz de Manila. His martyrdom has enriched the faith of the church in the Philippines as well as the universal church. Number 2, religious and charitable institutions. Since the time the apostolate towards the Chinese immigrants began in the 16th century, parishes, schools, hospitals, and charitable institutions were established through the work of the Chinese apostolate that had provided opportunities for mission in different forms. Number 3, family values. One of the remarkable contributions of the Chinese culture to both Filipino society and the church is the value of family. The spirit of hard work, discipline, respect, frugality, etc. are integral family values that the local church learns from the Chinese culture. Fourth, ecology. The famous practice of feng shui, or the art of placement among the Filipino Chinese and some Filipinos, can be part of a local church's discernment. It may lead the local church to study and discern more, to develop the love for environment and the care for the common home. Fifth, ancestor veneration. The Filipino Chinese perpetuate ancestor veneration in the families, and now they incorporate it in the liturgy, especially during the Chinese New Year festival. It is an area where one can detect the quest for communion, not only of the living, but also with those who have died. The practice of filial piety includes veneration of ancestors, which is one of the central activities of the Filipino Chinese communities. 6. Emergence of the middle class. One of the sources of the rise of the middle class in the Philippines is the Filipino Chinese community. The reform of the Philippine society is both an ecclesial and cultural concern. The local church in the Philippines is committed to alleviate the plight of the poor. The church strives to understand, live, and help the poor to rise from the pains of abject poverty. There were also great Filipino Chinese who were leaders in the government in the past decades and centuries. Antonio Estan said in his article entitled "The Chinese Mestizos and the Formation of Filipino Nationality," says that the Chinese mestizos played a significant role in the formation of the middle class, in the agitation for reforms, in the 1898 revolution, and in the formation of what is known now as the Filipino nationality. 7th, missionary institutions and movements. The capacity to share the faith to others is a manifestation of the third phase of Inculturation. Filling up the exigency of missionary priests is a sign of maturity in the Christian faith. Societies and institutes for missio ad gentes are important for enriching the universal church. Seminaries, charismatic movements, religious institutes, and mission societies, which have vocations coming from Filipino Chinese, Chinese Filipino, and Filipino communities, are signs of vibrancy in the mission in the Philippines.